So who's on my mind?
Hi, everyone. We're back with Food Literacy for All. I hope those of you who were on spring break last week had a really great break. We have a really wonderful conversation set up for us tonight between Dr. Ashanté Reese and Dr. Jessica Walker from our own University of Michigan. She was the faculty lead for this course last year, if any of you tuned in for those or were enrolled in it. Let me advance. Here we go. So as you know, if you've been watching before, but if you're new to the course, it's led this semester by me, Margot Finn. I'm a lecturer in Applied Liberal Arts, and also Shakara Tyler, who's a lecturer in Cs. We're also supported by our GSIs, Megan Gross and Nancy Hernandez, the SFSI coordinator, Kimmy Vandewedge, and the course coordinator, Sammy Maldonado, and also wonderful tech support from DJ CT, Chris Taylor. The 2024 Food Literacy for All course is supported by primarily the School for Environment and Sustainability and the Center for the Education of Women Plus, who give us the funding to support all the wonderful speakers that we have every week. There are a number of ways to engage with the course. We are still active on Twitter or X. You can tweet us at hashtag Food Literacy for All at SFSI_UM. We have poll questions. We've finally figured out how to make it so you can see them tonight. You should see the iClicker widget in the upper left corner, hopefully, of your screen. So we've got 3 poll questions. We'll do them pretty close to the beginning. If you're just joining us on Zoom and you're not a student enrolled and you don't have an iClicker, feel free to drop your answers in the chat. I saw somebody raise their hand earlier, and I will say that the raise hand function is not useful for us. However, you can put questions for the speaker in the Q&A, and you can put notes to the presenters. All of us will see them if you write them into the chat. So if you have a question or concern, go ahead and drop that in the chat. If you have questions for the presenters, put them in the Q&A, because the chat goes by pretty fast and we may not see those, where the Q&A questions are kind of stored there for the speaker later. So feel free to drop questions if you have them for the speaker. And then we also record these sessions and make them available on YouTube, and the links are all on the SFSI website as well, going back to the beginning. We have a reading response for you. Oh, and I'm sorry, I can't see the lecture notes and I don't remember who this is, but a response from a student about the readings that were assigned for this week.
This week's readings by Ashanté Reese are comprised of personal narratives while also incorporating historical aspects relating to Black food access and labor in the U.S. In her book, Black Food Geographies, several characters are interviewed by Reese, describing their experiences surrounding food within their Black community. One thing that was interesting to me was the interconnectedness of themes relating to Black identity, community, and food nostalgia, using memories and stories about the past to examine food institutions and shifts. These themes and narratives were also present in previous lectures with Farmer C and Shiloh Maples. Additionally, in the article Tarry With Me, Reese details a personal narrative about her investigation into the identity of the 95 bodies that were found at a construction site in Texas known as Sugarland 95. These bodies were Black laborers who worked on sugar fields through convict leasing under dehumanizing treatment and subject to harsh conditions. Through her delve into the historical context of sugar production in Texas, Reese acknowledges the contributions and struggles of those who were exploited for profit. One quote that resonated with me was, "It is my promise to defend the dead and to fight against our collective demise. It is my contribution toward an improvised freedom," reminding us to always acknowledge and contribute to the ongoing fight against oppression and exploitation of those before us.
Thanks, and that was from Sarah Kay. Sorry to not have the name previously. So let me get forward. Okay, and now I'm handing it off to Kimmy to introduce our speaker and the person she's in conversation with tonight.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, great to have Dr. Jessica Walker back with us this year. Professor Walker holds a joint appointment in the departments of Afro-American and African Studies and American Culture here at the University of Michigan. Dr. Walker's manuscript, Her Kitchen is the World, Black Women and the Culture of Soul Food, traces the construction of soul food using cookbooks, USDA narrative reports, television, and film. The project conceptualizes soul food as a battleground for Black representation within popular culture. These contestations often play out through representations of Black womanhood and domestic space. As a mentor, faculty instructor, and fellow for the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program, she has dedicated her professional career to attending to the importance and value of diversifying institutions of higher education. So thank you for being here, Jessica. And then Dr. Reese, thank you so much for being here. Dr. Reese is the Associate Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. She is the award-winning author of Black Food Geographies, Race, Food Access, and Self-Reliance in Washington, D.C., and co-editor with Hannah Garth for the collection titled Black Food Matters, Racial Justice in the Wake of Food Justice. Dr. Reese is currently working on two big projects. The first, tentatively titled The Carceral Life of Sugar, is a cultural history of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Imperial Sugar Company, and Sugarland, Texas, and reveals the entanglements of violence and care, sugar as a product of racial capitalism, and the role of sweetness in Black life. The second is a multimodal project titled Gather, and explores the ways Black people gather in the midst of anti-Black violence to nourish themselves and each other. So thank you both. You can come on, and I believe Dr. Finn will be leading you through some poll questions.
Yeah, actually, before I turn it over to the speakers, we're just going to get the poll questions out of the way at the beginning. So students, make sure that you have your either device or window open for the iClicker questions. And again, if you're just joining us and not a student enrolled in the class, feel free to drop your answers in the chat. Our first, a question related to the piece Terry with me that students read, and a question for everybody. Do you have a practice of making an altar or offerings to your ancestors, and does it include food or drink? And let me start the poll now. And I should be able to actually display the options this time. I'm very excited. All right, so hopefully this is starting the poll and sending at least this screen to people. And we should have about 50 seconds for you guys to respond. Good, I see responses already coming in. The piece Terry with me, as those of you who read it will know, begins with Ashanté making oh, and I'm going to get the name wrong. They're essentially a kind of sweet biscuit. Is that she can confirm in a minute, for an altar that she goes on to describe. And so we're wondering, how many of you have this as a practice, and if food is involved, as it often is with food and drink. All right, about 15 seconds left to respond. And I'll open the chat in a minute too and see if people have dropped any responses in there. Okay, and I should be able to, indeed, we see the responses. The majority, it looks like this is not something that people are doing, but for those who do, the 25% who said they do say it does include food or drink, whereas 11% may, or sorry, 6%, 11 people do altars or offerings without food or drink, and then several people saying they're not sure or not sure if what they do counts, which might have been my response. Okay, our second question. This is a sort of did you do the reading question. Who made up the workforce on plantations in the Sugar Bowl of Texas in the latter part of the 19th century after the Civil War? And I'll go ahead and start this as I read the options. So was this primarily made up of previously enslaved and now free Black men? Was it a convict lease program run by the state of Texas? Was it a federal program to bring workers temporarily from Mexico? Was it a mix of freed Black men, displaced Indigenous people, and migrant laborers from Mexico? Which one of those best fits what you read about today in terms of who were working on the plantations in Texas in the area now called the Sugar Bowl? The people who answered B are correct. I wonder if D felt like the right answer because it was a variety of options, but indeed it was that convict lease program where, so there was they were subcontracted by the state of Texas from these plantations. And the third, so relating to the chapter of Black food geographies that you all read, how does nostalgia shape the stories that Deanwood residents tell about food access in their neighborhood, past and present? And again, I'll start the poll as I read the options. Is nostalgia working to distort the view of the past of older residents, especially? Something that old people are kind of like looking back with a romantic view of the past. Is it B, that changes are seen as an equal mix of positive and negative? Is it C, that both young and old people lament the loss of community connectedness? Or D, that it reflects a tendency more of the young to romanticize the past? So is this A, older people having a distorted view of the past? B, that mostly people see the changes over time as being a mix of positive and negative? C, young and old lamenting the loss of community connectedness, both? So a decline, a negative change seen by both, or a tendency to romanticize the past by the young? What did you guys say for this one? And this one, an over a majority got right. So C, that both young and old people are lamenting the loss of community connectedness. That best describes what we read about in that chapter 3. All right, I'm gonna turn it over to our speakers. Thanks very much for participating in the polls, and I'll look at the chat and see what people said there too.
Good evening, everyone. Hello, Dr. Reese.
Hi, Dr. Walker.
So good to see you. And I know it's been a long day, so I want to ease us in a little bit with
Okay.
a question just about what food communities are you learning from, delving into?
Yeah. Okay, so that's the softball tonight, huh? First of all, let me just
What's
go
your
ahead and
favorite? What's your favorite dish?
I'm gonna go ahead and just give my thanks to everybody who got me here. I guess third time's a charm. Thank y'all for continuing to ask me to come. And so this time it actually worked. And then for those who don't know, Dr. Walker and I go back to grad school. We overlap different institutions, but had overlapping time in graduate school. And so if you don't know her outside of this, you should try to get to know her. I'm so ready for your book.
Me too,
Just
girl.
one of those. I'm so ready for it. It's just one of the best thinkers I've had the privilege of thinking alongside. So I really just appreciate a lot of the work that you've done.
Same, Dr. Reese, same.
Now, let me get to your question. Food stuff. Okay, so there's a few things. I think here in Austin, there's a community called Clarksville, and they are a former freedmen colony here. And so for those who don't know, this is a community that was established by newly freed Black folks after the Civil War, built up this whole community that now is called the neighborhood of Clarksville. And they have what they call a heritage garden. And one of the things and so Clarksville is complicated. I'm gonna temper my words a little bit since we're being recorded. But so it's got this history of being a freedmen's community. But as you all probably know, there is no space that Black people have created in the US that has gone untouched. That Black space is under constant threat in various different ways. And because of its location in Austin, it has been one of the targets for gentrification, one of the earlier targets for gentrification. And so some people who still live in the neighborhood have wanted to preserve some of that early history. So they have a heritage garden, and I've been working with them to learn about and think about what would have been grown during the time that they were a freedmen's colony. And they're planting those things, which is really cool. And we're also working on getting a historical marker for the garden itself. So there's that. I am always following the work of the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, which I am not as connected to as I was since before the pandemic, but just some really cool things happening there, like the Center for Afroecology that came out of some of that work. I just think is not a small feat and really amazing. And the journal that's going to be launching, all these things that I think like when we talk about self-determination, like they're trying to put in practice, which is really, really cool. And honestly, I would say I'm learning a lot from friends. So during the pandemic, I started a practice of cooking and baking with friends on Zoom. And I'm doing it less these days, but we still kind of swap recipes and experiences, and actually have one coming up next week with another friend. We are let me shout out a book real quick. Crystal Wilkinson, I don't know if you've read it yet, Dr. Walker, but her book, Praise Songs for the Kitchen Ghosts. So we're gonna prepare some of the recipes from that book together next week.
my
And
God.
so, yeah, so I guess there's like a range and a scale of things that are inspiring me right now.
And I love how, and I mean, look, I know we're doing a class and a webinar, but I'm going to try to not go into these tangents where I'm really interested personally in all of these, like you say, all these different layers. But it's fascinating how all of those things are part of your work: public memory, historical interpretation, connection through relation, and cultivating this type of intimacy. And one of my, I think, most interesting aspects of the praise song, which I haven't gotten to, but I really want to dig into, is this kind of simultaneous grief and celebration that food can hold, and that food traditions.
Yeah.
And so I think I want to go into, because you mentioned that the Freedmen's Project, which is so fascinating to me, um, this idea of kind of public memory and public space.
Yeah.
And how you're thinking about kind of the role of food in interpreting that. Both of the pieces that folks read for today gesture toward, or are very explicit about, what we need to do to kind of change what we see in the land and change
Yeah.
how we evaluate the land. So how have you seen the evolution of kind of food and public memory, as people kind of reckon with anti-Blackness in the food system?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I the first part where you were mentioning Crystal's work and the grief, the most immediate thing that came to mind to me is that gone are the food studies days where we can only talk about celebration, in my opinion, right?
Absolutely.
Once we start layering in things like um, anti-Blackness, indigenous land rights, like all these things are where we have to really think about how the very spaces that we're occupying hold not just memory, but grief, and have been spaces of not just care, but also violence. And what does it mean for us to not think about those things as binaries, one thing on one side, but like the very care that we say uphold our lives have also been so intertwined with violence. And so that's one of the things that comes up a lot for me with working with and thinking through some of these things around Clarksville, because I think initially the Heritage Garden was a way of like celebrating and commemorating, which I'm like, yes, I am on board with that. But also, we have to take into account that Clarksville, if we think about it as a contained space like this, was pressed in on all sides by the same white supremacists who had enslaved these folks, right? And so, how do we also capture that what we imagine and what we dream and what we create is still surrounded by anti-Blackness? Like, it's like what Christina Sharp is talking about. It's the weather. And so if this is the weather and we're producing these things within that weather, then how do we account for both of those things? And so, that's the first thing that comes to mind for me. I think public memory is really interesting, right? Because right now, so you all read the piece about, you read Terry with me, and there's been so much work that has been done in Sugarland over the last 5 years. And part of that work has included the question of like, what do we do now? Is this a monument? Do we create something like the lynching memorial? Like what is here? And I'm a little troubled by those questions sometimes, because sometimes what I want to ask is, what do you want these things to do and for whom, right? Because if we're just marking sites of violence, then we need signs all over the place. We just need to be, the whole US would be just a walking sign of violence, right? Like that is just what it would be. And so I think we should push ourselves to really think about like, what do we want it to do? And in my mind, especially when I think about the work that's happening in Sugarland and people, and still really putting in a lot of thought and care and figuring out what is happening, my thought always goes to, what are we trying to create? And is there something that we can say about this particular moment, this particular place, that will help us create something different than what occurred here? Like that's where my mind goes a lot of the time. So that's there's commemoration on one hand, and there's creation on the other hand. And I think that is where public monuments in memory can be the strongest in terms of what can be created. I don't want to get all super duper political here, but I think the people who erected the kinds of monuments that we contest, Confederate monuments, all those things, they knew this.
Mm-hmm.
They knew what these different monuments do in terms of what is possible, in terms of not only the narratives that they create, but the space that is created around them. They knew this. And so for me, I'm like, how do we do that on this side of things, right? When we want to commemorate something different.
Right, which questions even, like you're saying, the scale of what a monument looks like.
Yeah.
It's something that we can kind of take home with us. There's so many iterations. And of course, I can't help but thinking about Kara Walker's installation many years ago of the Sugar Sphinx
Yeah.
as a kind of a provocation, like this monument made of white refined sugar with these molasses made helpers
Yeah.
in the Domino Sugar Factory, I believe, in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Um, and
And what was
so,
so, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, Jessica, but what was so cool about that exhibit too was that it was a provocation and it was a living provocation. By the time I went to see it, those little sugar babies had melted so much, they were deformed, like they looked like they were missing limbs. And so it was such an interesting way to be in a space that we don't think of as we don't think of well, now I do, but like we don't normally think of sugar as like a living, breathing thing that we can interact with and that we should interact with, and that it can actually prompt us to think differently around what we're consuming. And that exhibit, just walking in, I still remember the smell of what
yeah.
smelled like rotten molasses and sugar. I'd never smelled anything like that before. And it just made me think about, wow, this is what it means, at least for me, to like really disrupt this idea that we are in some ways complicit in the systems that we are operating in. And when I'm talking to students about complicity, the one thing I say to them is that when I say complicity, I am not saying you are complicit, you are therefore a bad person. When I say complicity, I am saying we are bound up in these webs of relation such that none of us are on the outside of them. And so all of us are having to figure out where we are along those webs of relation and what we can do at that point. That to me is what complicity does for us. It helps us think about, this is not about me being a good person. If this were just about feelings, well, I'll just leave it there. This is not about feelings, and this is not about me being a good person. This is not about me being a bad person. It really takes us out of that, that kind of guilt and fragility that we can feel, and really puts us squarely in a conversation around what is my duty and responsibility to the people I'm bound up in this web with. And that's how I think about like my relationship to the Sugarland 95. And then also to the place where I might be, to the people, to the workers I may never see. Like, what is my responsibility here?
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I love that calling on of sharp with the weather. It's kind of all around us, and complicity kind of acts as that same condition. And it's also the condition through which we experience pleasure with foods, white refined sugar or not. Um, which kind of brings me to, I think, one of I love chapter 3 of Black Food. I mean, I love all the chapters. I teach it often every year. But chapter 3's idea of nostalgia, which is a very complicated set of feelings, but also practices kind of brought into the present. How do we distinguish between memory and nostalgia? And how do you kind of delve into those differences? Especially when it comes to food as a racial project.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, when I think of nostalgia and when I'm writing about nostalgia, I'm really thinking about nostalgia as an embodied experience that then informs how we understand a place or our experience with something. And so to me, that might be different, related, but different from memory, because something about nostalgia also just evokes like a strong urge for something that we think we don't have anymore. And I don't think memory always does that. The other thing I think is that to some extent, we will hold true that memory is frail and fraught.
Hmm.
But once you introduce nostalgia into any kind of thing, people are less likely to contest, right? The whatever the thing is in question. So I'm trying to think of an example around this. So for the project that you all didn't read about, Gather project, I spent so much of the last summer going to people's family reunions, which was fun. 10 out of 10, recommend going to people's family reunions. And to understand like how these food practices and other things kind of figure into how they gather, why they gather, what is the urgency around gathering. And I remember I met this one at one of these family reunions. It was a small family, and the oldest man in the family was telling me stories about their childhood and on the Eastern Shore in Maryland or whatever. And there are these moments where he was basically what he was saying were things that were very like misogynistic, for one, right? Like there was these things that were like, things went wrong. Some of the stuff happens in Black food geographies too. Things went wrong when women go do X, all this stuff. But because it was layered with these stories of, he had such endearing stories about his mother and other women in the community. As I'm looking around, I can see people are reacting to the misogyny and no one says anything. And like, that's like an example of like, we get caught up in this way of people feeling like people have a right to feel tender about things that they miss. And I don't even actually think that that's untrue, but it operates differently, I think, when we think about Blackness in food than say the same way people might have nostalgia when people say like, like you see sometimes on social media where people like, I wonder, I wish I could go back to live in the early 19th century. And like people be like, wait a minute, I'm not going back to the early, and so there's a way that we contest that when we're like further away from it. But something about how we think about food makes people, make people be like, oh yes, you get to be tender around that. And I think I was sensitive to this in Deanwood in particular because so many other things, nostalgia is also something people can control when so many other things around you are outside of your control. The neighborhood changing, cost of foods are rising, you might be aging so much that like you're watching your peers pass away. So there's a way that I'm like, I get this. I get and understand that you're trying to hold on to something that feels good. Most people are not nostalgic about something that felt hurtful to them. Right? Like there's pleasure in nostalgia. Yeah. Which is why people being nostalgic about, well, I wish I could go back to the 1900s is like really fucked up in some ways, right? Like I'm like, but that's also an example of how like one person's pleasure might be another person's pain or violence. And that's very much like true about so many things.
Yeah, I mean, especially food, right?
Yeah.
And I often think about, I believe nostalgia, and this might be wrong, the historians in the audience can get at me for this, but I think nostalgia was first coined in the Civil War as this kind of disease of longing, like a real issue that people couldn't detach themselves from what was before. And I kind of think about that as a longing that can never really be satiated in some ways. But chapter 3, it does such a good job of telling us how actually, like you say, it's actionable. It mobilizes people to kind of create a narrative. And I think that, lots of people can say, and this is often the problem going between the structure and the individual, right? I have family gatherings. I have a grandmother who longed for the, old days. So in talking to that person who sees kind of aspects of their community, maybe reflected in parts of Deanwood, what are some ways to think through that? What are some things to be careful of? What are some possibilities? for thinking about cross-community connections.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Also, I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A. Please, as things come up, drop them in there. Because I'm curious to hear what you all are thinking about. So, what's so interesting about Black food geographies, and I think also to some extent the Terry with Me essay, is that it has resonated with people that I didn't think it would resonate with, right? Like that there's something like what you just said about the kind of original definition and the longing. And I love what you said, like a longing that in some ways may never be satiated. I think most of us are walking through the world with that on
Mm.
some level. And people have tapped into that, right? Like tapped into this idea of like, I really connect with this. Or like, the thing I always tell people is that for the most part, I won't go so far and say that this is universally true, but most people have a food story. And I would go so far as to say have a food story that they want to tell somebody.
Mm.
And they want to share it. And there's something about being able to connect over these stories that's been really interesting. Now, what I think is challenging is that, and I think if there was something I would improve on Black food, I think everybody wants to improve something about their books. And if there was something that I would improve on, I would really go further in theorizing self-reliance and self-determination. Because I think what I have noticed on the other side of the book is that even though I say in the book that like the ways Black folks historically have employed self has kind of always been connected to community, that's not how people read that.
Mm.
Right. So I get stories from people around, I mean, basically like bootstrap stories from across different kinds of communities. And so that's a really interesting kind of drawback because that not not that these stories don't matter, but like somehow like that community part gets lost there. And so it's just a story about a triumphant individual and their family. And so that's really interesting. And when that comes up in class, I always try to ask students, I get curious and ask them to get curious about, well, who else helped them to do this? And like what communities were they a part of and that kind of thing. Um, the other thing I think that is we should be careful about with nostalgia is that it has a way of erasing difference and really meaningful differences that I think um, are useful, especially for those of us who are interested in any version of justice. Are I don't have the direct quote in my mind, but I'm of the Audre Lordian school of believing that no version of justice requires us to erase difference. It requires us to work across lines of difference. And so nostalgia can be a real robot for that sometimes, right? Because again, back to what I said earlier, like for the most part, we feel that people have a right to feel tender, or not to use your word, like a longing for something of the past. But like if that is incongruent with a version of the past in which like your longing may have been related to my subjugation, then that creates like that creates some friction there. So I may have gone a little bit off tangent with your question, but I think I think about difference. I think about how the self gets kind of misconstrued sometimes. I'm gonna take credit for that or take the heat for that in terms of maybe how I wrote it. I wish I would have gotten a little bit more deeply into that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I get that it's kind of it's a thin line, right, between self-reliance and that bootstrap narrative. And I'm also struck by how individuals want to share, like you're saying, they want to share their
Yeah.
stories
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
way of relation,
Mhm.
but they also want to take the triumphant nature of that only on themselves, right? Which is these are just the archetypes of the American dream. And so the
Yes.
self that we have to think about is actually a self that we have to undo, the one that
Yes.
tells us how progress is made.
Yep.
what it takes, often away from things that are, self-reflective. And so I'm struck by that duality that people both want to
Yeah.
share from the book. And that was actually my other question is, what are some audience responses that have
Yeah.
surprised you or seem memorable,
Mm.
that individuals want to share, but they don't want to take? And that makes sense,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
because to be in community is not just to be around other people, it's actually an
Right.
introspection of yourself and what
Yeah.
you.
And interdependency is hard for US Americans, like
Yeah, we
it's
don't
a
mess with
really
that.
difficult, well, this is just not a thing. And you got to really work really hard at it. And I think your thought about the undoing is a part of it. I also had before I go there, I had a thought that was related to your question of nostalgia too, that I wanted to mention. So 2020, the pandemic happens. The grocery store shelves are bare. People are trying to get all the seeds and start all the patio gardens and all of these different things. And what was there are a lot of interesting things about the pandemic moment for me. But one of the most interesting things was that for the first time, I realized a lot of people had never encountered a grocery store that had bare shelves and made them think about like a supply chain, like literally like where your food is coming from. And so the pandemic may have opened up a world of like different things for a lot of people. I think it did. The other thing that was really interesting, and I want to kind of use this as a way of thinking about difference. Nostalgia, there were a lot of people who really got into gardening and like were connecting this to like family histories and memories and all these kinds of things. But I think there were two different approaches. I think there were people who were like, I'm going to go the rugged individual route for whatever reasons. That's not a judgment. And then there were some people who were like, I want to seek out organizations and communities that were already doing this, and maybe like I can connect with them and maybe I can learn more. So in other words, I think the pandemic in terms of the food system really created, you really start to see, so you started to see where people fell on this spectrum in terms of like if the pandemic was prompting like a withdrawal from or moving toward like a more communal understanding of food and the food system. I just thought that was really interesting. People like Black food geographies. I think the most thing that I get is that they like the writing, they like the stories, which I'm going to just say for the benefit of everyone here, I didn't feel like I was doing anything novel. I felt like when I went into the field to do field work, like people told me all these stories. I would actually like to share as much of their storytelling as possible. And so that was part of it. So people like the writing. I think people also I get a lot of comments on the conclusion, actually, where I kind of lean into this idea of grief and what happens when I wrote this whole book and in the process of it, like two people died while I was writing it. What does it mean that I spent all this time and they spent all this time with me and they never get to see this product? And just kind of pivoting toward thinking about the stories in the book as mini blueprints of what we might think about as freedom. And this is what I would love your thoughts on this, actually, Dr. Walker. I've been really mulling around this idea of like the limits of capital F, capital J food justice, not just in terms of what has happened with just, nonprofit funding and all of that, but like also these things that are happening on a daily basis on the ground that don't get taken up as capital F, capital J food justice? And what do we do with those things? So I guess maybe I'm saying I've been thinking through this question of scale. At what scales do we imagine and practice food justice? And who do we imagine is doing those practices? And what do we do with the people who are like, I don't know nothing about food justice, but they're like doing the work in their communities every single day? I don't know what to do with that, but I've been thinking so much about this. And this is actually honestly why I started the Black Gatherings Project, because I wanted to think about I firmly believe that there is something about the ways Black folks gather that matters to how we practice and understand food justice. That's how I started the project. And I
Mhm.
wanted to think through that. And like a concrete example of this is one of the chapters in the book part of this is about post-funeral repasts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a practice that like I didn't know other people didn't do, to be honest, right? Like it's like
Yeah, that's
it's
all
been a
happened.
part of my life my entire life. The thing that I know about funerals is that if your family, someone in your family has died, someone else is going to take care of food for you.
Mhm.
Not just for the funeral, perhaps days after, weeks after. And I'm going to make a point about this. I'm going to speed this up and say one of the things that I write about in this chapter is when Tyree Nichols was murdered by police in Memphis. 11 restaurants came together in Memphis and had basically a citywide repast for the people who came to town to support the grieving family. That to me is what I mean by like, what can we learn about Black gatherings that we might scale up?
Mhm.
So, what would our food system look like if we had practices where when you are deep in grief, someone else says, I got you.
Mhm.
There's no world in which you are preparing food for yourself or having to care for yourself in that way. I got you. That's what it means to be a part of this community. Black people do that. Is there something we can learn from that that helps inform how we understand our food system
Mhm.
and re-understand the future of our food system?
Yeah, absolutely. And the problem of food justice, capital F, capital J, is also what we learn from the family gathering that happens on a city scale. So
Mhm.
I think that the tension, right, is kind of something that we've been talking about, that scale of the individual versus the structure in the American dream, in the myth of the
Yeah.
American dream. Um, and this false dichotomy that we often have to go between, that it's either one or the other, or that you have to start at the individual and then work up to the
Yeah.
larger community
Yeah.
structure. But I thought of initially actually chocolate cities, Andrea Robinson and Anthony,
Mhm.
right? So we're more than two Black people are gathered. That is the city. That
Yeah.
is a Black community that constitutes
Yeah.
um, that space, or reconstitutes or reimagines that space. And also, I think Scott Barton, or so, I've been talking about repast food a lot, because
Mhm.
the repast food is a certain kind of food.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's an opulence
Mhm.
and a kind of luxury to it. It has to stick to you, it has to
Mhm.
hold you over. And so there's also, this is not a haphazard coming together. People, this is a genre of,
Mhm.
of healing as well. And so, yeah, the scale of food justice that's not named as food justice is also um, that kind of the prefigurative politics of the everyday, that kind of just
Yeah.
doing,
Yeah.
even when the future is threatened. It also reminds me, I was talking to someone who does urban gardening and a lot of sustainable business practices in the Detroit area, and they're kind of like pulling their hair out, like urban gardening. They're like, it's the same garden over and over. People have the same book in Detroit. They get this book and they say, this is how you do a small garden. It's the same thing. It's like, no one asked for that lettuce. No one around here asked for that lettuce, right? And so their frustration that what they deeply care about, their hometown, what they deeply care about has kind of been, has had an interesting kind of mainstreaming that I think
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
we have to kind of contend with, right? We're
Yeah.
many decades into alternative food movements, or however you name it. And so there's also a lot of representation
Yeah.
that comes before how people imagine the possibilities of food justice. Um,
That's so interesting you say that because it also makes me think, you know how like, well, I used to joke about this when I lived in Atlanta that like you knew a neighborhood was gentrifying because they had a colored door. You know, like you got like a yellow door, you got a red door, like, okay, this is the thing. And I think there's something similar
Real.
around this idea of like community gardens in some places,
Mm-hmm.
right? That like even the notion of what belongs in that garden it's already prescribed. It is
Mm-hmm.
already like, you know, decided because there is a certain level of conspicuous consumption on behalf of some of these gardens. And I think that this is where I get really specific with people around the kinds of projects that are inspiring to me. Um, it isn't that I am inspired by community gardens writ large. Again, it's kind of like, what are you trying to do with the things that you what is the purpose of this? And you know, like I write about the one garden in Black Food Geographies at the Public Housing Project, and I still to this day, this is still what I think of as one of like the most profound um examples of like experimentations in freedom, because what you also know about community gardens is a lot of them are still structured around this idea that you get a plot, you get a plot, you get a plot, you get a plot. And so it's like we are in community because we're next to each other, not because we are working this together. And that's not how they structured their garden. And then the other part of that was, you know, at the end of each month, these are people who might still, you know, month might have been longer than money. And someone would come and like get what they could out of the garden and make these huge pots of soup.
Mm.
And people can just kind of like come by and get it. And I mean, I think about that and I'm like, you know, sometimes when people say the folks who are most impacted by the inequities in the food system are the people who should be leading this work, I think sometimes people say that and they don't mean it. But like, I truly mean it. Like that I looked at this example and was like, yes, this is the kind of stuff that like you on the other side of town with your individual plots, you maybe can learn something about how this group is coming together and dealing with conflict and sharing resources and all that. I mean, it was kind of like really a socialist project that no one called socialist, right? And didn't need to, right? Like that wasn't the point. The point was they were like, we have a need.
Right.
And we see that there's a collective need. Like I might have an individual need, but we all in the same boat. So let's like make sure that we're, you know, trying to share resources together.
Yeah.
And so like it's interesting because maybe part of what inspires me to think about what's happening on the ground right now is that well, there's two things. One, I get really frustrated. I am very frustrated by how notions, even under the umbrella of food justice, the justice is a very small part.
Mm.
It's like food is big and justice is small. And I think some of this has to do with funding and what is measurable, et cetera. But if we're really interested in justice, we know that that's not linear.
Right.
We know that that isn't just about food. And we know that this is as much of an infrastructure question as it is a like, and by infrastructure, I mean even beyond food infrastructure, but like it's as much of an infrastructure question as it is around, you know, what we might construct as healthy or unhealthy eating, right? And so I think I was starting to get frustrated by seeing organizations that have been toiling for years, groups that might not even be formal organizations, but have been doing the good work for years, and they don't get funding because they don't have the right words and measurements to get the grants. That is extremely frustrating. And so I think there's a way that I'm really interested in. I don't have the answers to that problem. I don't, you know, but I'm interested in thinking about it. Because so much of what we see that gets uplifted is kind of like justice light or a lukewarm version of justice. It's not about redistributing resources. It's not about building infrastructure. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think that that's, when I think about visionary people in the food world, I'm like, I don't think that that's what they're looking for. It's not what they want.
Feel good justice. Feel good justice.
Feel good justice,
Yeah.
measurable justice. Like I'm like, I don't know what I'm just like, this is really, it's really interesting to watch it. And it's been interesting. I won't name the organization, but there is an organization here that has done some really good work, particularly with young people. And when they were trying to find a new executive director and they reached out and they were like, who do you think? And I was like, here are the people that I would suggest you reach out to. These are, and I kept pointing in the people who were like, doing like justice work. And they're like, we're more like a youth development organization. We're not really a food justice organization. And I was like, you just told me everything I need to know. Like, I mean, I don't know what to do with that, right? And so that's what I mean by like, but they're known publicly as a food justice organization. Like that you ask people in this area who are the food justice organizations, they're going to be on the list. But then when it came down to like, you get to make a very important decision about who you hire as your ED that might actually like further the work or like, start to create a pipeline or infrastructure so that this works a little different. And that's not the direction they want to go.
It's this impulse to separate issues as discrete.
Yeah.
And it makes it simple. It's also scalable.
Yeah.
Which brings me to a question around evaluation, and then I'll get to a question from our Q&A from Derek, a really good one. But there's lots of great lessons in both of these pieces about evaluation. How do we do it in our food system? Who's an expert? Whose stories matter? And I'm especially struck by this word tarry as a dwelling and a staying in. So can you talk about your own kind of evolution as I don't know if I'll call you a food researcher, but methodologies, collaborations, how's that changed over time?
Oh, yes. Okay, this is such a great question. And I love answering this question. So for those who read the book, I used to teach middle school. And so I won't rehearse that entire story, but like my interest in food came from teaching middle school. Came from some of the questions that my middle school students were asking me about food resources in their neighborhood versus my neighborhood. And as someone who did not grow up in a city, as naive as it might sound in my early 20s, I was not thinking about these questions because I grew up in a town where there were 2 grocery stores. You went to one or the other. It had nothing to do with where you lived. It was just kind of like you go. I mean, now I would say that differently. I'm like, there are some things around where you live, even in a small town, but like the point being, like I hadn't really thought about it in that way. And so when I decided to go to grad school, that's what I want to think about. But I was very much interested in this connection of like access and its relationship to health. That is how I entered grad school. That is what I thought I was going to be studying. And, I think one of the things that changed for me was that honestly, that's not what people were talking to me about. And so I think as a researcher, you can make 2 choices. There's probably more, but 2 choices in this way. You keep pursuing the thing that you thought was going to be the thing. Or in my case, what I talk about is I follow Black storytelling and I believe that it'll lead me somewhere. And that is the choice that I made. I'm like, I'm going to follow your stories. You tell me where you want to go. I'm going to follow it. So I think that was a huge methodological shift in terms of like, I think there are things that we don't talk about as researcher, like what is the role of your intuition? And what does deep listening actually look like? If you're not hearing the things that your research protocol says you should be hearing, like what does that mean for you? Are you, I feel like I hear people say things all the time like, well, if people don't want me to do this project, I'll abandon it. And will you? Like, I mean, that's a real question. Like, I mean, that was a real question that I asked myself. I'm like, I still want to do something on food. People are not talking about this stuff. What do I want to do next? And so I think that was part of it. I think after I wrote the book, I became really frustrated with conversations around access because I felt like conversations were starting and stopping at access. And so like recently I gave a talk that was kind of like tongue in cheek titled Against Access, which I'm not at all against access, but I was trying to like kind of develop a thought around what if we didn't use that as a framework?
Right.
And I think what I've been playing around with a lot more is the Black radical imagination and thinking about what happens when we apply that to food or food justice work. Does that open up more things for us versus like, in my case, using, food access as a primary frame? And so that's, I mean, for the students in the room, that is one way of saying who I am today as a researcher is not who I was 15 years ago when I started this work. And that is you should expect that. 15 years ago, I was still using the language food desert. You ask me today, like I can go on a whole thing around like why we shouldn't use that language. But that is years and years of being in community with people and talking and studying and all of that stuff. And failing, and trying new things. And so I think it's so funny. You were like, I don't know, would you call you a food researcher? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know what I would call myself right now. And I think that's part of the evolution too, right?
Right.
That like how we define and situate ourselves changes over time. And I'm in this really interesting place where I have not, and I'm not giving up doing research on food, but I'm so much more interested in like experimenting with form and experimenting with being a creative at the intersection of being a writer and a researcher versus thinking that the creative stuff has to be on the side, right? And I'm trying to figure out, and also still being deeply committed to some version of rigor as a researcher. And so, I'm trying to figure all that out.
It's so fascinating, Dr. Reese, you say you didn't know you were, it was such a groundbreaking book, but the way that you're thinking through um, the role of the researcher, intuition, not as something that compromises the work, but that can actually like necessarily guide it.
Mm-hmm.
You stopped at, you didn't have to question access. There's a version of this book where we could delve deeper into that and how to fix it, right? And so really paying attention to as many stories as possible, you said, storytelling at the forefront. To me, these are innovative approaches brought to these kind of questions.
Yeah.
Storytelling, especially, what you're saying makes me also think of Our Mother's Kitchens, which is this group that centers the storytelling of Zora Neale Hurston and Octavia Butler and all these, Black women writers and the ritual of cooking as also a part of kind of a gardening or a connection with the soil.
Yeah.
Again, another scale of food justice that we might not quite see as that. So I have so many thoughts, but there's some great questions here in our Q&A. Derek
Okay.
Moreno actually asked about Mashma Bailey. And actually, there's connection to Edna Lewis and communism that we can talk about offline, but Mashma Bailey wrote an essay that was featured in one of Edna's edited collections.
Okay.
And Derek says they're a former segregated bus station in Savannah, Georgia, pays homage to the history by evaluating traditional Southern food. At her chef's table, she speaks on nostalgia and how she uses her travels and learning from fine dining kitchens to create dishes that speak to her upbringing. And you've seen a trend in the Black chef community to do just that, take their food from their childhood and modernize it without losing its core identity, which I define to be incredibly beautiful and motivational to do the same in my food with Mexican cuisine. So not a question, but an affirmation, certainly. Thank you, Derek, for that.
Yeah, I do have something to say about Derek's comment too. Thank you, Derek. I think, first of all, I think Mashama is such a beautiful chef, like just period. I think she creates beautiful food and a great experience. And I think the fact that they decided to open that restaurant in the segregated bus station is exactly what I mean around like thinking about and not shying away from how we're interacting with these spaces that have been potentially violent spaces. The other thing I want to say about Black chefs, I think there are so many Black chefs, past, present, and probably future, who their point of entry into the work isn't, I want to be a chef. Some people's point of entry is, I want to create or recreate a feeling, an experience, or something that I've had. And, I'll use an example of this that isn't, I'll use two examples. One, I just finished up this project with the New York Knicks where they were highlighting like chefs and Black chefs and recipes. And as a part of this project, I was doing some of the kind of writing of the background of like what different dishes might mean or parts of the dishes might mean. And almost every single one of the recipes that were submitted has something to do with the chef's background. almost every single one of them. Didn't matter what kind of restaurant they had. And so I think that speaks to this idea that you start from what you know. And one of the things that I think is so beautiful about Black people specifically, and potentially like just people who've been marginalized in general, is that the fact that you can start from what you know means that you have kept something that has not been stolen from you. I think is
Exactly.
one of the most beautiful things to me. And
Right.
that you reaffirm that that is important by starting there, I think is just one of the most beautiful things.
Absolutely.
And then the second thing I'll say is just kind of a personal story. So every year on my grandma's birthday, which is June 18th, I always make a blackberry cobbler, which we never called it cobbler, we called it blackberry pie, because that is something that she would make for us when I was growing up. And we would go out and we would pick the wild blackberries, we would bring them, and she would either make the pie then, or she would freeze them and she would make it for us later. And so to connect to your point about nostalgia, every year I try this and every year I fail to make it like she makes it. Every year. I will never, and this is not something that I do not even think this is possible that I can make it. Like that I'm under no illusion. But there is something about that ritual of doing this every year on her birthday to honor her, to try again, that encapsulates so much of what I think about the Black radical imagination and care. I do it differently every year. Like I feel like I fail every year. I recount a story every year with my sister, my older sister. I ask her questions. I have this whole file where I've all these questions I've asked her. Do you remember how mama did this? Do you remember? And it becomes this point of connection for us as well. And so I guess like I'm saying this to say, as much as I have a critique of how nostalgia operates on a structural level sometimes, that doesn't negate what nostalgia does for us personally.
And I mean, part of the Black radical tradition can contain these contradictions. It almost has to, right? And
Yeah.
that notion that recipes have to call up a past, it's
Yeah.
because just like you said, they're responding
Yeah.
to the conditions that eliminated or disconnected something.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
cooking is a type of a eulogizing. It's an accounting for that
Yeah.
can't happen in other spaces, which is so
Yeah.
beautiful. It kind of calls that out. Um, so I mean, I have so many things, but the idea of tarrying and what you
Oh
just
yeah, you
talked about,
mentioned that. Yeah.
well, you just explained it. I mean, the
Yeah. Yeah.
back to this recipe,
Yes. Yeah.
and you talk about in chapter 3 about the epistemological difficulties, how
Yeah.
we know what we know when we know
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that the pain and but the pleasure of that return. So
Yeah.
Terry is such a compelling term
Yeah.
for your approach as a creative, as someone who's
Thank
insisting
you.
about, insisting what food looks like in this Black radical
Yeah.
imagination.
It's one of my favorite words, by the way. Like,
It's a great
and
word. Bring back Terry. Like what happened?
I love the word. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that my introduction to the word Terry is in like Black church faces.
Absolutely.
Right? Like this idea that you are tearing at the threshold, like you are
Yes.
like, and a lot of times that is tearing literally meant that you are weeping and praying and refusing to let go of a thing until like in you kind of the biblical terms, until you bless me. Like I am here with this thing. I'm going to keep wrestling with it because there is a hope and a belief and an expectation that the tarrying will lead to a need being met.
Yeah.
And there's just, yeah, I think there's a lot of beauty in that. And I think it kind of, even as someone who is not particularly religious, there's something really useful about thinking about having some terms that help us connect both like a visible practice to like something that is immaterial, right? Like whatever that immateriality is for you. But like I love that. And so it was like that essay, it also felt like the word also feels like it mimics what I am doing on a regular basis with like trying to write a book that I've been working on for like 4 years. That seems like it's never gonna, but it's like I keep showing up to it because I have an expectation that at some point, like the things that need to click for me are gonna click. They haven't all clicked yet, but
Right.
like it's going to happen. And so I show up and I'm there, and then sometimes I'm away from it and I give it space. But like Terry also suggests also, honestly, it's another way of thinking about the longue durée to me. Like,
Mm,
usually terre is not used in a context where something is going to happen immediately.
yeah. But again, the expectation folded in. I do want to get to these questions. We actually have a set of questions, a few from anonymous folks and one from Sydney. They all kind of point to this problem of naming: food
Yeah,
desert, food
yeah,
apartheid, where are we with that?
yeah.
One's a public health student talking about the
Mhm.
benefits of community gardens. We use the term food deserts. Can you
Yeah.
explain that kind of a little bit more?
Yeah, so I'll maybe just lump all these questions together if that's okay. And if we can just leave them in the open thing for now so I could keep reading them, that would be great. So food desert. So let's think about it this way, right? Like if we think about like how food desert is named, this is one of the points where I wish I could see some of your faces and see if you're nodding with me. So when you see food desert used, often it is to point to there are no grocery stores, there is no access to healthy food. There is lack, and more lack. Like that has become synonymous to the idea of food desert. And my initial kind of irritation when I started to really think about it is like, this metaphor it doesn't hold actually. The way that we characterize a food desert doesn't actually mimic what we know about actual deserts. Even so, on the surface at a desert, we might see nothing. We might see lack. But what we know about actual deserts is that there are organisms, there are living, breathing organisms that are a part of that space. There are living, breathing organisms that are kind of part of the infrastructure of deserts, and that they're teeming with life in a lot of places, right? So where the food desert metaphor fails is we don't get to the life part. We stay at the lack. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I will say is that food desert, so again, if we're kind of keep thinking about this metaphor as a place, points to a place and not a process. So anytime we point to a place and not a process, there's a whole lot of people who get off the hook, a whole lot of people who get scapegoated. And so some people, and I'm going to fold in Sydney's question, so a lot of people especially fold in food apartheid as a way to help us think about the racialized processes that create the spaces, the food spaces that we live in. I think food apartheid, I use food apartheid a lot, especially when I'm talking about the urban food system. I use it less when I'm talking about rural food systems because some of the things that we think about race and racialization don't quite work the same way in places like Appalachia, for example, right? I don't think it means apartheid doesn't apply there, but I think we might need to think more carefully about the specifics of what's going on in those places. So, food access, I still use the term food access a lot if I'm like talking to people. I think it's something that like people can grasp onto, but I also try to help them understand like when I say food access, this is what I mean. There's also the term supermarket redlining from Elizabeth, I forgot her last name. But it's a public health person actually, I think, and it's from a 2001 article. And so I love the term supermarket redlining when I'm talking specifically about supermarkets because it ties this historic practice of redlining with the practice of supermarkets deciding where they're going to go and where they're not going to go. I don't actually use the word food swamp very often. I'm going to be honest, I just don't like the term, but it's not like I don't have a very intellectual critique here. I think there are some similar things that we can say about food swamp as we say about food deserts, right? And so like a lot of times people will ask me specifically about dollar stores. And so, one of the things I would say about a dollar store then is like, yes, we can make dollar stores the villain in this story, but we got to think about what created the gap for dollar stores to fill. And so like I think maybe one way I'm saying this is that language continues to evolve and change because language itself continues to fail as we get more and more specificity around the things that we are talking about. I think food access is inherently a race neutral term. And I think the ways that food apartheid and supermarket redlining, they point specifically to racialized processes. And so I am more inclined to use those terms. Anonymous attendee. So here's the thing about community gardens. I don't want you to think that community gardens are terrible. I don't think they're terrible. I think not all people are working toward the same ends. So in the context of this conversation and the kind of work that I do where justice and liberation are the goal, then that is how I evaluate community gardens. So to me, I think that there are some community gardens that are meeting an immediate need, which there's nothing wrong with that, and have no connections to kind of larger structural things. And those tend to be the gardens that I am less interested in general, while I also honor and recognize that meeting immediate needs is an important thing. And I think the ways that capitalism is structured, we often feel like we have to make a choice between creating a vision for a long-term vision versus meeting people where they are in their immediate needs. The reason I don't let community gardens off the hook is because I think we have some really good examples of people who met immediate needs and had big visions for the future. I mean, I think most of the people on this call have heard of the Black Panther Party. That is an example of thinking about how food figured into a larger plan and meeting people's needs. Now we could talk about the gendered politics of that and all that. I think that could be a really great conversation. But like the idea that, you know, we're trying to meet immediate, intermediate, and long-term needs, and how do we strategize around that? I think it is entirely possible.
Thank you for that that rundown, which also I think pinpoints how our language evolves on this issue and how there might be, right, there's some weird kind of utility that people have to have with using race neutral words, and like we're saying scalability or getting grants, funding,
Yep.
and the things that apartheid might signal. So it's that there can be utility in all of these terms, but
Yeah.
we need to, I think, attend to the way that the language is changing. Sometimes we get overwhelmed. The language is changing too fast. Why can't food is food, right?
Yeah.
But the language is changing. It reflects also something that's happening on the ground.
Right. And I think, you know, listen, I live in Texas, and right now there's, you know, all kinds of things happening in the legislature in terms of like stripping language around particularly around like diversity, equity, inclusion, those kinds of things. And it's probably only a matter of time before that starts to trickle down into the research part too. Anyway, but I think one of the things we might consider then is like maybe another way of thinking about it is what is at stake if I don't use language that points to the specific problem that I am trying to address. And so, you know, one example would be that like, I think it is fairly common practice right now for people to talk about racism in the food system. I think there's more space for that. I think people are still very uncomfortable with food apartheid as a language. And I think because, especially in the US, people don't, you think apartheid, you think South Africa, you think of that particular regime. And I think people don't want to be associated with that, right? And because it requires you to look differently, right? Apartheid means a systematic process, a set of policies that created the conditions that people are living in. And when you see it, you can't just be like, okay, then I'm just putting up gardens. You also got to think about like what are the actual conditions that are creating this? And so and does our construction of these gardens help us get at those conditions?
Mm. It's a way of saying what happened here, what
Yes.
actually happened here.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings us to our last anonymous question around the topic of the U.S. carceral system, convict leasing, farm prison labor, and food justice in your current work. In our last few minutes, what are some of the connections there?
Okay, so this is a good question. It's a good question to end on. So when I started the work that I am doing right now on Texas prisons and agriculture, it was honestly in part because so I'm a Texas native. I grew up in Texas. I grew up in East Texas. I grew up within 45 minutes of about 10 prisons. And they're just a part of like the everyday landscape. I also grew up in a household with a single parent who worked as a prison guard in all male prisons for 30 years to be able to take care of us. And so part of what started this process for me and this question for me was how do I, as a budding abolitionist make sense of the structures and the labor that created the conditions so that I can be in grad school and be a budding abolitionist, basically. And because I was doing food work, I said agriculture is the way to do it. And because I also knew that Texas prisons had such deep investments in agriculture. And so where I started the project was really looking at the prison's agricultural land. And so there are, I think, 54 state prison facilities in Texas. Across those 54, there are about 185,000 agricultural acres. So just shy of 200,000 agricultural acres. So what I mean by agricultural acres are, this is land that they only use for growing, grazing, raising livestock, all of that. 200,000 acres is not a small amount, right? And so then you might ask, where do these things go? Some of it, a lot of it goes back into the prison system, but then some of it filters into the public in the ways that, like, lots of states have relationships with their prison institutions. You make stuff, then public institutions have to buy from you. So there's that. So I read this study from 2019. This is, I'm going to get to this point around the food justice aspect. I read a study from 2019, and the numbers suggested that it would be cheaper for the state to purchase things instead of growing them themselves. So instead of having prisoners grow food that goes back into the system, it would be cheaper for them. They lost money on doing that versus. And so then the question becomes, in a state that is so interested in preserving its bottom line, why then are you so invested in a practice that loses you money? And this is where I get to the kind of carceral logics, right? So then you start to think about carcerality isn't just about the prisons. It's a web of relations that trickle out in all of these different ways. And so I started thinking about this in terms of how it goes back into the past, the convict lease system, the present. We've got people who are working current prison farms. Well, I don't know if they call them farm, but they are prison farms. And then, you know, there's a future with a big question mark. So there's that. The other thing that helps us think about this in terms of like the losing money aspect and thinking about carcerality as bigger than just prisons is that we have never had a US food system that was not dependent on some kind of captured labor. And by captured, I mean enslaved, I mean imprisoned, or otherwise captured in some really fucked up immigration policies and such, right? And so part of what I'm interested in these intersections is that carcerality seems to be something that connects across these different types of labor that might help us understand how we theorize freedom and food justice. So much, not all, but so much of what we think about as freedom and food justice is really about a right to eat, a right to live, a right to have access potentially to the means of production. And so what I think I am like suggesting, part of what I'm suggesting is that there's a prequel to that, which is really getting at how our infrastructure, our food infrastructure is kind of built on a carceral logic such that it has become a technology that reproduces itself across different periods of time.
Yeah.
Right. From indigenous land theft all the way up to the present. And so there's a part of me that feels like if we understand this and like as something that is connective rather than the silos that we understand, then that question mark that I say about the food justice and the future, like I think we can start answering some of those questions around what we're creating. And so the last thing I'm going to say about this, because I know we have to go, is that I am part of this book that I'm writing on sugar. There's a section on repair. And if anybody has thoughts on how I can do this, I'm big on ideas, sometimes slow on execution. But the section on repair, I've been thinking about, okay, so if we know that a parcel of land like Sugarland has both been stolen from indigenous folks, has been worked by enslaved people, worked by people who are in prison, what would repair look like? And so I've been creating these maps, or in my mind, creating these maps of reimagining Sugarland as a parcel of land.
Hmm.
Like if the land that became Sugarland was liberated, what could we do with it? And then another set of questions I've asked is if the 200,000 acres that the state owns was liberated, given back to the people, what could we do with that? How would it change our food system? That at this point, that is the level of repair I'm interested in, right?
Mhm.
And so I think something about seeing that same plot of land kind of be inscribed in violence over and over and over and over again, I'm wondering and I'm hopeful might help us to think like, oh, okay, yes, this justice thing isn't just about consumption at all. And actually, we can't even ever get to the ethical consumption part without really dealing with the very basis of our food system, which is the kind of carceral logics of labor.
Absolutely. I have ideas on that, and I think it's so innovative again to think through carceral logics, not just like you say, a warehousing of people set aside, but a web of relation, of
Yeah.
a type of intimacy, right? That we often don't think of.
Yeah.
So we do have to end. Unfortunately, I know everyone's, oh no, but we are at that time. Any last words before?
Yes, I just want to I saw the last question come in from someone who's anonymous, and I just want to invite you. You are welcome to email me and I will answer this question more thoroughly, because I don't want you to walk away from this with the idea that studies about food access are not worthwhile. I don't think that they are not worthwhile. I think we have mined what we can from thinking about food access in terms of the study, like the research. And so we've amassed a lot of data. We've got so much data. And at this point, I'm like, what do we do with that data, right? Food access is still useful in terms of people getting what they need. If the next level of questions is how we change our food system to be more sustainable and to be more equitable, I don't think more studies in food access get us there. So I hope that clarifies, but you're welcome to email me and I'm happy to talk more about it.
Thank you so much, both. This was an incredible conversation. I was madly trying to jot down some of the best quotes, and I just typed frantically for the entire time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again so I can get some of these announcements out to students. Here we go. Okay. As you know, let's see, let me maximize. The primary source assignment is due today, theoretically at 6 p.m. And I see that over 200 of you have already submitted it, and thank you. If you haven't yet, go ahead and get to that. There's no, we're not going to penalize you strictly if you didn't get it in, particularly if you thought it was actually due at midnight or whatever. Just, get it in soon. The deadline was today. And if you don't get it in by this weekend, we won't be able to consider it for the top 30, from which you'll select the 10 that will actually be featured on posters that second week in April around campus. So we're going to get on formatting some of them into actual posters that we can show you in a little over a week. All right. The GSI-led discussion this week is on Zoom Friday from 1 to 2 p.m. The link is here, and you can also see the link in the syllabus, so do feel free to drop in. The discussion in Dana, it's, I think, 3556 Dana, but check the syllabus for that. Wednesday from noon to 1 will be there as normal, and you're welcome to drop into either of those. The next field trip is on the 22nd of this month from 1 to 2:30 p.m. A tour of the sources at Special Collections by Julie McClune. I also wanted to call your attention to this deadline is extended to tomorrow. There is a food themed variety show. Anybody presenting in it, selected for presenting in it, will receive $75. So you can get paid a little bit to be part of this variety show. Go ahead and submit your ideas if you'd like. And just a reminder that the courses at the biostation that we mentioned a little bit ago, the deadline is coming up here in mid-March. It's obscured a bit by my Zoom screen right now, but mid-March. So if you're interested in taking classes up north this summer and getting credit for doing things ranging from microbiology to general ecology to I think there's a few English classes as well. Do check those out, and there's details at the QR code here if you're interested. And next week, we will be hearing from Reem Kassis about cuisine in context, the history, evolution, and challenges of Palestinian food. And the readings, if you tried them before a couple of weeks ago, some of them were subscription only. They've been replaced, so you should now have access to all of them for free. There will be a few more readings coming. They're going to be recommended, so the quiz questions wouldn't be based on them. But we did get some other readings from Ms. Cassis, so I'm going to add those to the syllabus again as recommended readings. And I think that's it from me. Thanks again to everybody for the conversation this evening, and I'll see you guys next week.